My name is Christian. Can you all hear me? All right. Back there. Yeah, my name's Christian. I am on the sales team here at Glover, and I also do marketing. So if you've been to these classes, you've probably seen me running around behind the scenes, helping out with the handouts. I, um, I do social media and the email newsletters that you get if you're on the list. So I'm behind the scenes a lot, but this is my first time teaching a class. So I'm really excited to be doing that, and about something that I enjoy, that I'm passionate about: Waterwise plants, um, and Waterwise gardening, which is kind of what the idea is behind Flip Your Strip. So let me get started by asking you all, um, have any of you done a Flip Your Strip project before?
I don't know if that's what you call it. But
Yeah.
I've dug it all up.
Okay.
Planted some more stuff.
Okay,
But
you've got a
need some help.
got a project started. Any of you wanting to do a Flip Your Strip project? Okay. All right. So I want to start by just kind of going over what that idea is. And I came up with a somewhat of a definition, and it's kind of my own definition, because it's kind of a vague concept. Um, but essentially, you're taking your park strip or some kind of non-functional lawn. Usually, your park strip is going to be lawn, or maybe it's weeds or dirt, um, and you're converting that to a planting bed with Waterwise plants, drip irrigation, maybe some mulch or flagstone, ground covers, that sort of thing. Essentially, you're turning it into a garden bed that is going to be more water efficient, and hopefully less maintenance than a lawn, or more beneficial to uh, the environment, to pollinators and other wildlife, and just prettier to look at than just lawn. More attractive, yeah. Um, and park strips are a good test case for Waterwise pollinator gardening, because they're a challenging area. It was generally kind of the default was to put in grass, you between the street and the sidewalk, and you walk back and forth from your car to the sidewalk. And grass was kind of the easiest thing to do for a long time. Um, there's maintenance in that, but it was convenient. And with attitudes changing about gardening for pollinators, gardening for water efficiency, it's a good place to start. Trying to remove some of that lawn and adding some benefits along the way. So following along on the handout, I just listed some of those challenges. Those are narrow areas. They're maybe a little bit more difficult to maintain or mow, because they're right off the street. Usually they have a lot of reflected heat from the street and sidewalk, from asphalt, um, road salts in the winter that can spray over and um, hurt some plants. Um, and then it is also the area where you go back and forth and has some foot traffic, so you want to be mindful of that. But it is the opportunity to lower your water usage there and your maintenance costs to beautify your yard. So it sounds like we're all on board with that. Um, and for a long time, that meant xeriscaping, which people confuse with zero-scaping. So a lot of people would just tear out their lawns and put in weed barrier and then rocks on top and then no plants. And that's a good way to go from Salt Lake to Phoenix, basically, and get an urban heat island where everything just heats up. So we don't want to go that route with the flip your strip idea and just put in rocks. We want to plant plants and trees, and some rock, or mulch, just to anchor things in. But we're definitely trying to get away from just the all rock xeriscape. Xeriscape actually just refers to how xeric, with an X, not zero, plants can be and how minimal amounts of water they need. So that's the direction we're heading. And to incentivize that, governments, cities have put a lot of money behind rebate programs. So there is a lot of monetary incentive to remove the turf, put in drip irrigation. So are you familiar with some of these programs in your cities? Has anyone tried to apply for anything yet? So it can vary based on the city that you live in and what water district it falls under. Here in the valley, there's two major water districts, the Jordan Valley and Central Utah water districts. And for a long time, it was kind of confusing where you would go to sign up for these things, for the rebates. But I've got a QR code here, this first one, and the website. And it's kind of all being centralized under this Utah Water Savers program. So if you're thinking about starting one of these projects, go there, put in your city, and then it'll tell you what district you live in and what the rules are. And we've got some handouts for the rules and eligibility, but the general rule is to qualify for the rebates, you need to have existing maintained lawn, and to not have started the project. They like you to wait until they come out and have an inspector come out, assess the area, how much square footage you have, and then they base the rebate on that. I think in Jordan Valley, it's $3 per square foot back. Okay, so if you're in West Jordan, South Jordan, this end of the valley, you can pass this around if you'd like. But that's where the QR code will take you to there. But you might want to try still just to see if they'll.
Yeah, I already have a drip in.
Oh, okay.
I'm on the way.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in Milk Creek, but I see the water bill, $30 water.
Okay, yeah, it's one of the two, so you'll find that there. And then so there's the rebate for just removing the lawn. There's rebates for switching to drip. That's also where you get a water efficient toilet or appliances. They do rebates for that too. So that's a good place to start, because then you know kind of the size and scope of your project. The inspection someone will come out, measure your area that you're working with, and then that'll give you kind of the idea of where to start and how much money you would get back. You have to pay the costs up front for your plants and your irrigation and any installation costs, but they do refund that fairly quickly from what I understand. So you do get some money back for that you can use here to buy plants. So yeah, lawn must be living or dormant. That they will probably cover. Yeah. Yeah. If there's weeds in there, they'll be okay with that. If it's like dormant in the summer where it goes really dry and brown. That's just dormant. It's not, yeah, or green. But weeds are fine in there, yeah. And that's part of the reason to do that is to at least manage the weeds a little bit better. Um, then when you're thinking about the overall plan, you want to think about your irrigation. You're most likely converting from overhead sprinkler systems to drip irrigation, which is you know um, essentially the idea is to get water directly to your plant and not just spray a wide area. So you get water right at the roots from plant to plant. You're not um, wasting a lot of water through evaporation. It's just direct at the ground level. And that is a big water savings too. So you're not just throwing water out into the air. Um, um, when you're thinking about that installation process, you also, and the scope of your project, um, you might want to think about how much you're capable of implementing yourself with irrigation, and how much, um, and if you want to get professional help. The second QR code there is for Quell, which is Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper um, Professionals. So that's a site where I think it's nationwide, but you can look at a map of landscapers who are qualified through various certifications to do water efficient landscaping, to do drip irrigation. They do these projects all the time. So they can help work through irrigation problems. And a lot of other landscapers, even if they're not maybe in this list, people that you work with for landscaping, or we have recommendations here. They do Waterwise landscaping and irrigation. That's a big shift in the industry now, so everyone's on board with that and learning how to do that. So there's a lot of help out there if you're not as technically skilled converting your sprinkler system over to drip, because you want to do that properly. You want to make sure there's no breaks in your lines and no leaks. You want to get it done right so that you don't have to worry about any flooding or any issues moving forward. Um, and then another thing to think about is with that drip, how much water you're actually delivering to your plants. Because we recommend drip for all kinds of plants, water-wise or not, hydrangeas, roses, trees. Different plants need different amounts of water. What you see behind me are all water-wise plants that I've picked out that don't need a ton of water, but still most things would like a little bit of water. But there's plants like hydrangeas which would need a lot more water. So you want to think about um, when you're picking your plants and when you're setting up the irrigation, how much water you're delivering, um, how much water those plants need. And we'll sure.
While you're talking about that, so for those plants, kind of getting those to be planted together, they would essentially need the same.
So yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit with picking your plants. But generally, what I've picked out and what I would recommend and what we recommend here if you're with a salesperson is grouping things together by zone, hydrozone, what they call it. And for me, it's just easier to kind of think about picking all the plants that kind of need similar water requirements and not picking plants that need different water requirements for the same area for a park strip. Generally, when people are designing their park strips, they're picking plants that do just need the same water. But occasionally, there's something that you might enjoy that you want to see in there that might require more water than or less water. If you do cacti or agave, those might need less water than some other things. And that's where you can set up different zones with your drip irrigation, where you can deliver different amounts of water to different plants. Then in that planning process, you also want to think about, oh, I skipped over this, how you're going to remove your turf. And that's where you might want to get into professional help. Because I've done it personally with the sod cutter. I had neglected turf with weeds, and roots can be really deep, and it's hard work to get remove that sod, even in just a small area like a park strip, even if it's just 2 feet wide. Hand removing is really difficult. Using a sod cutter is helpful, but that's still hard work. So again, there's companies out there that can help do that. With park strips too, you kind of want to dig down a couple inches below the surface level, so that you can get your plants in and your mulch down lower, so it's not just spilling over onto the sidewalk and street. You kind of have a flush level. So those are considerations too. Again, if you're up for the challenge, you can certainly do it by hand, but there are companies that can help with that. But again, if you're doing rebates, you want to wait until you do that work, until after you have an inspection, to start that. But not too late to start, or too early to start thinking about it. Then getting into the idea of mulching and weed barrier. For a long time, weed barrier was just kind of a standard practice. You see, we still have it and sell it. And there's been a big trend in moving away from weed fabric, weed barrier. We're standing on it now, and it can be helpful in some areas, but the general recommendation now is to avoid using weed barrier in planting beds. And the reason for that is it inhibits weeds for a while, but it also is not 100% effective. You can still get weeds that will push through, especially if you get tears in the fabric somehow. They'll push through. If you have mulch, yeah, and then if you have weeds will grow on top. If there's any bit of soil, they'll grow on top and then down through. So then if you're trying to remove the weeds, you rip out the fabric, and it's harder. They kind of intertwine with the weed fabric, and then you're ripping out fabric, and it's harder to rip out weeds. So general recommendation now is a good thick layer of mulch, about 3 to 4 inches, if you can go that deep, and that suppresses weeds. You will get some weeds, but they'll be easier to pull out, especially when they're younger. And then it'll allow for moisture retention if you're using an organic mulch. We've got examples here. When we say organic mulch, we mean bark mulch, or something like a soil pep, which is just a broken down mulch. basically, or wood mulch that helps keep soil cooler, retains moisture, and then as it breaks down, it also adds nutrients back to the soil. And then inorganic mulch, which is your rock or gravel, can also be used. There's I've heard mixed things about whether it heats up your soil or cools it down. Um, Professionals have said that good thick layer of rock mulch with proper plantings and more plant coverage can help cool the soil. If you just have rock and a few plants, then it's going to heat up. But if you have more plant coverage, it can also be beneficial in the way that organic mulches are. Um, so yeah, we've got weed barrier, but we don't necessarily recommend that anymore. Any questions about any of the planning before we get into talking about plants? Okay. So who came today to help to get ideas about picking plants and designing the park strip? Okay. So what questions or concerns do you have about choosing your plants? Anyone want to share?
So my concern was the water zone that you spoke about.
Okay.
Like, how do I make sure that
Okay. So how to manage the hydro zones and same amount of water for plants?
Yeah, I think mine is like I have the tubes or whatever with the holes in them, but I need to be able to know how to put more into it to get it to the plant themselves. Because right now it's just like, brown plastic, hard, with a few holes in it. And so I have to either plant the plants right next to there and get there. And I do want to get where I'm like, do you want my plants all bunched, like a bunch of them, or just kind of, you see them with bigger plants? That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like some strips have like lots of plants and they're just like jammed.
Mm-hmm.
My neighbor's is like that.
Yeah.
It's lovely. And then some are just like a big plants with a couple of little ones. I don't know. Just trying to choose to get to the right. And if you have a drip, then how do you know how much water is going out? Do you need to talk to your person that put it in? Can they tell you that, or what?
So yes, there's a few different things we want to touch on there, but let's start with just talking about the general idea of a design for park strip. How many plants? What kinds of plants? Does it need to be really full packed, or do you want to have things spaced out? And that's where your personal preference comes into play. With the incentive and rebate programs, there are some stipulations for the kinds of plants. Basically, you don't want really the plants. There are some height restrictions and width restrictions. Um, you don't want plants that are feedback. You don't want plants that are going to be too tall that block sight lines. You can have trees, which will then kind of grow up and provide shade, but you don't want like a 6 foot tall grass blocking that view. They generally want shorter plants, and then you don't want plants that are going to hang out way into the sidewalk, especially plants like that are going to attract a lot of bees, and you're trying to walk over and run into the plants. You want them to be a little bit more contained. So designing the park strip and then designing the irrigation zones really up to personal preference beyond that. Um, we definitely recommend low water, water-wise plants, or drought-tolerant plants. And I have a little in the middle there. Um, there's a little breakdown of what a few of those terms mean. You'll hear a lot of terms thrown about water-wise, drought-tolerant, low water, water efficient, xeric, and they all mean slightly different things. They're all kind of getting at the same idea. Um, you'll hear probably drought-tolerant the most, but essentially what we're getting at with picking plants for park strips to be lower water usage, not necessarily drought tolerant. I mean, many of these plants can withstand a drought. We're in a long-term drought here, but we're going to be delivering water to the plants. We just want that water to be delivered efficiently and with enough regularity that they can handle that. So it doesn't have to be a lot of water.
What about dog tolerant plants? We have a lot of people that want dogs.
Okay. That is another.
It's a busy neighborhood.
A whole other concern that I don't think we've got a list of that, but we can get one made up. But generally, most of these, like most,
Twice a day.
do you have plants that
Well, right now
that die off from urine,
right
or?
now it's just bindweed and grass.
Okay.
My concern would be trying to keep things
Okay. Well, we'll get a list together of known dog tolerant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We do have, and then looking at this little list at the top, salt tolerance too. We deal with secondary water. Does anyone have secondary water? So that's down in the center of the valley and into Utah County. Water from Utah Lake is really salty and alkaline, and that harms plants too. So these plants are all tolerant of that also. So we'll get a list of dog and dog urine tolerant. I mean, most of these plants can also be, they're pretty durable. So, if dogs were to trample through, they can handle that once they are established.
It seems like once a dog has peed there, then other dogs want to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To mark their territory. Yeah. Yeah. So there's things you could do too. One thing you might want to try is incorporating some bigger rocks or boulders into the design, so that might draw them a little bit more, so that it doesn't get to the plants. Mm-hmm. But talking about plants, there are thousands of options to choose from, and it can be overwhelming. You have different categories of plants. You have your ornamental grasses, your perennials, ground covers, and thinking about combinations of those is, I think, what trips a lot of people up is like what plants go well together, what plants go well together aesthetically, but also for watering purposes. And there are a lot of resources to help out uh, with choosing plants. A place like Glover here, we've got sales staff who can help you pick things out. We've got resources on our website. There is also this new app and website that's part of the Slow the Flow and Utah Water Savers campaign. They've rolled that out this year. That's what this little stand is, and there's a QR code here. But essentially, they have tried to think through that problem of what plants go well together, and how to make different combinations work. And their formula is think of 3 different characteristics for a plant combination, and then kind of repeat that. So plants with blooms, texture, and foliage. So blooms are your flowers, texture, like your grasses with seed heads, foliage, you've got different leaf shapes and colors, different types of plants. So their recommendation, and this is based on Utah preferred plants. So this comes out of local resources for Utah recommended plants. So you can go on there and, on your phone or your computer, and you can pick different plant combinations and pull them out. It's kind of like an AI software where you can get your 3 different plants, swap them in and out, and it'll tell you which, you can swap them in and out. It'll tell you which, what characteristics, height and size and bloom time, bloom season, water requirements, sun requirements, all that kind of stuff. So if you're tech savvy, that's a good resource for you. You can certainly also just walk into a nursery and do that in person, and that's kind of what we'll get into, the plug and play part of this class. We can start pulling things out and putting combinations together.
Also, has everybody been down to the water conservation garden? So that is, maybe we'll touch on this in a second, but that really is mandatory for you, because that's why that garden was created. And they have got several actual park strips that are planted out. And what's very nice about that is that instead of sort of imagining what things look like on the computer screen, you can actually see it in front of you, and it's all labeled so you know what's going on. That's an invaluable part of this process, and it's all live and in person just down the street from us.
So that's what I do have here. Have you heard of Localscapes? So Localscapes is a program out of the Conservation Garden Park, which itself is part of the Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District. And so that is their display garden. I think it's 8 acres. It's just down the street. Have any of you been there? Did you say? Okay. So they have a lot of resources as well. So they have a whole bunch of park strip designs too that are pre-made. They've got these design examples on their website, different PDFs that you can look at. And like Paul was saying, these are all on display there. So they have a whole section where they have the different park strips laid out. You can look at the designs of where you would put the plants and how they would look all year round. They're open, year round, so you can go see them in all different seasons. So if you just want, a preset design to plug in, they've got great resources for that, and I'll pass that around for you guys to look at too. But that's all in that last QR code with Localscapes. So that's where you can find their designs. And they also have a lot of other resources, and they've been doing that for quite a long time. At the Conservation Garden Park, they've got great examples of mature plants throughout the seasons that you can look at, and they're all going to be Waterwise, water efficient kinds of plants. And they do classes also and events. So they do more in-depth classes on irrigation and other design aspects. So they're a great resource for a lot of different things, plant material as well. Just thinking of something. So just to touch on the Localscapes idea, and that's something that came out of Utah through the Conservation Garden Park. And the Localscapes idea is essentially the idea of flipping your strip for your whole yard, taking chipping away at some of your lawn in a larger area and putting in garden beds, usually with some kind of, they call it a central open space, is their big idea, where you leave some lawn, functional lawn. So that's the idea of functional versus non-functional lawn, where you still leave some lawn for kids to play in or pets to walk around in, but you are just reducing that total area in areas where you don't necessarily need to have lawn. Usually the outer edges, you can put in more plants and that sort of thing. So that if you want to go beyond just your park strip, that's a good resource for that too. Considering that idea. Going back to picking plants, we talked a little bit about the different requirements, but you want to, when you're choosing, we're losing some plants here, but when if you're trying to pick out plants, trying to figure out what plants will do well, you want to look at your tags. And we get plants from a lot of different growers, so they're all going to have different kinds of tags, but they'll all have the same information somewhere on there of height, spacing, which is kind of the width that it'll get to, your hardiness zone. You want to make sure that you're picking plants that are cold hardy enough and not just marginal. And we can talk about what that means too. They'll often say when they bloom, because we'll get plants maybe that aren't in bloom yet, but it'll tell you the season, light requirements, full sun versus partial sun, that sort of thing. Sometimes they'll most often have some kind of care requirements, like this grows best in sunny, hot areas. So you want to look, for that kind of stuff, and it's going to be different designs on different tags, but it'll kind of all be there. So when you're picking plants, you want to think about all those different care requirements, different points of interest, the season of bloom, seasonality. There's plenty more. and also availability. So a lot of times we get specific requests. Someone will have a design plan, or they've looked up things on the internet and they want the specific variety of catmint, cat's meow, and there's maybe 15 or 20 different kinds of catmint, and we don't have the one that they're looking for, or at least had initially had in mind, but we may have other similar substitutes. Might be slight variation in size, color, but there's often a lot to work with if you're willing to kind of be flexible um, with your substitutes with different kinds of plants. Oftentimes, you get different trademark plants, so you get the same or nearly identical kind of plant, just from a different grower with a different name. So there's a lot of that going on. A lot of hybridizing and breeding with a lot of different plants. Coneflowers is a good example where you've got, probably hundreds of different varieties of coneflowers. If you're looking for a red coneflower, you might, have 25 different ones to choose from. If we don't have that specific variety, we might have another one that you're interested in. Thank you. Seasonality, plant size we talked a little bit about with the requirements for your cities, but we also want to think about spacing and coverage, and that there are some requirements with that for incentive programs too. How much coverage, whether it's 50% plant coverage at maturity, 75%. There's different stipulations, and it could be kind of flexible too, because it's kind of nebulous how you're planning things out, and I think cities can kind of work with you based on what your vision is. Personally, I prefer more plant coverage than not, but it's personal preference. But you want to be mindful when you're picking plants how big they're going to get at maturity and how much coverage they're actually going to provide you. Like a plant like this is going to be a bit more widespreading. It gets up to 18 inches, but it'll spread a little bit. If you go with some of the more shrub type things or junipers, those will give you really wide coverage. Like a juniper like this, super tough and hardy. It's going to get maybe 4 to 5 feet wide. So think about that when you're picking plants and planning things out, about how much space they'll take up. Of course, if you go more of a ground cover route, these are some ground covers here. That's a really good way of covering a lot of ground with fewer plants. You get a flat and you kind of space them out and they'll fill in. So plant coverage, let's see. And then getting back to the hydro zoning, what is recommended now is our smart controllers. And this is where I don't have personal experience. but I know that they do provide rebates for smart controllers, which is where you would kind of base all of your water zones if you were doing different water zones. So you would have a controller like you do with your overhead sprinkler system, where you have your different zones for different areas. You essentially can set up the different areas for different plants. Like if you were gonna have 2 different hydro zones for your plants in your park strip, you have a line and drips out to certain plants that get a certain amount of water per watering. And then let's say you have a tree that you've planted in the middle. So I've got some tree examples. And you want to have a different amount of water get to that tree. So you have maybe a few drips set up around that tree. So you would set that up in your smart controller to have just your 2 different amounts of water. And then you could do even more for that. Or if you set up if you have other garden beds that you switch to drip, which you can also get rebates back for that. Let's say you have a bed of hydrangeas closer to your house, you can also put those on a drip with another frequency as well. So you have a lot of options with that. But that's where I think that the Localscapes site has some more in-depth irrigation technique videos and resources, where you can learn more about how to control those hydro zones. Yeah.
So Localscapes, I know that there's the conservation garden. That's a place you can go to. But Localscapes is not a place. It's like the website, right?
So
like or is it part of it?
It is part of their display there.
Okay.
So it is a program and set of resources, and the display garden is basically a Localscapes
at the conservation
display garden.
Okay.
Yeah, they actually have a house that they built. It's kind of a shell of a house, but they set up a house with some different lawn areas and a Localscapes design with different plants and a park strip, and then you can walk down that area, and that's where the park strip examples are. So if you want to, they'll have more resources there about different hydro zones, and so that's where, Localscapes is a part of the conservation garden park.
Another source of information for hydro zones is that's mandatory visiting for all of you. The Red View, that's up at the University of Utah campus, or above the university. And they are now installing tiered gardens up in the hillsides. And those tiered gardens are designed to illustrate hydro zones. It's not as user-friendly as what the garden park is, because the garden park was designed strictly to help you translate what you see there into your yard. But Red View Gardens is a civilized thing to do anyway, but it's also really a well-designed, practical installation of the kinds of things that you could take back with you to your own house. And then what's nice about all of them is that they are arboretums, which means that all the plant material is labeled. And that's a lot of times what people are looking for too, is what am I looking at and where can I find it?
Another thing to think about with hydrozoning and different kinds of plants is what kind of sun exposure you have, and if you have any shade at all. Some park strips are completely exposed and get full sun most of the day and just bake and get really hot. So certain things might need a little bit more water there. The same plant maybe might need a little bit more water there than if it were in a partial sun area where it gets a little bit more shade, can retain a little bit more of that moisture. So the same plant may need different water requirements, different amounts of water based on location. And Utah is a tricky place where we do have a lot of different kinds of planting areas, and the amount of sun and also wind exposure, especially through the winter, but also in the summer when it's windy and dry, things can dry out pretty quickly. So that's something to consider. Maybe even in your same yard, you've got the same plant in the park strip, and you've got the same plant in your backyard in the park strip where it gets more sun. Might need a little bit more water, especially early on to get established. So that's another thought. These plants I've selected here to kind of play around with are all full sun plants. Most can take some partial, but there are some people with park strips that are fairly shaded too. And there would be maybe a different set of plants for a shaded park strip or a partial sun park strip. So that's another thing to think about, picking your plants. There's a lot to consider. Utah is a tricky place to garden, but it's pretty rewarding. I think that you can grow a lot of really neat plants, and we have a lot of great options. I kind of at the end of what I wanted to talk about with plants, and then we can open this up to a few more questions, and then I know we advertised it as a kind of plug and play kind of interactive class, so we could do that in a few different ways.